La personne qui va vous parler maintenant, c'est Juan Pablo Canala. Juan Pablo Canala enseigne la littérature argentine à l'université de Buenos Aires. Il est un chercheur très renommé en Argentine. Il a été le directeur des collections spéciales à la Bibliothèque nationale de l'Argentine. Il a publié des essais sur les écrivains Manuel Puig, David Viñas, Borges, Roberto Arlt, et il finit une œuvre importante qui analyse la pensée politique et littéraire de David Viñas. Juan Pablo Canala.
Thanks. Well, it sounds good, right? Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank Cheng and Alberto Mangel and the authorities of the Collège de France for inviting me to participate in this colloquium. I thank them for their hospitality and for all their efforts to have me here today. Thank you very much. It's a great honor. Well, my presentation, it's a part of an ongoing research about the work of Jorge Luis Borges I have been conducting for some time. This research could not have been possible, but for the years I served as a director of special collections at the National Library, there I was able to become familiar with Borges' manuscripts, annotated books from his personal library, and first editions. Also, while director of the National Library was Alberto Mangel, he made it possible the acquisition of Adolfo Bioy Casares and Silvina Ocampo's personal library. His generosity allowed me to participate in both the acquisition and the cataloging process of that treasure trove. My research aims to elucidate the literary, aesthetic, and ideological operations carried out by Borges by examining his critical interventions, reviews, prologues, and essays, editorial work, the publication of anthologies, and outreach work, lectures, and courses for the public at large. Also, I try to incorporate into my critical readings the material traces of Borges' writing present in his manuscripts, annotated books, and writing notes. In doing this, I follow Roger Chartier, who argues that critical studies of literature require attention to both things, la textualité du livre and the matérialité du texte, if they aspire to shed light on the reading, translation, and dissemination processes through which Borges, in this case, composed his work. Going after the aforementioned materiality in Borges' text, at least initially, a difficult task. Borges used to get rid of his manuscripts, and he would abandon or give away his books. And incredibly, we do not have a single physical repository that contains the entirety of his archive. Following the pioneering work at Laura Rosato and Germán Álvarez at the National Library and Daniel Walderston at the Borges Center, in the last decade, I devote myself to gather materials scattered in different libraries, public archives, private collections, and antiquarian bookstores. The aim was to rebuild a provisional and incomplete Borges archive. In Georges D. Uberman's perspective, it is only through the assembly of these surviving fragments that the materiality of Borges can be put back together. Furthermore, this allows us to dispel the enduring myth of Borges' overwhelming erudition, shifting the image of the wise old writer towards a much more interesting figure, that one of the Borges as a reader. Considering Borges as a reader allows us to transform the static erudition into a complex and dynamic network in which his works combines and relates different texts. To make a long story short, that question that guided my research is how Borges positioned himself by constructing a canon of authors and texts and by positioning a genealogy that gave a prominent position to certain areas of literary culture while relegating others. Taking all of this into account, the guiding question today: what are the operations behind a very unique version of Buddhism in general and Chinese Buddhism in particular? Following Raymond Williams in my research, I strive to identify the selections that Borges carries out from amongst the proliferating repertoire of available traditions regarding Buddhism, or to put in simpler terms, based on which authors, sources, and quotations Borges built his particular view, essentially a definition of history, philosophy, and literature on Buddhism. Today, I will present some findings from that ongoing research. To answer the aforementioned questions, we should start by asking yet another. What imaginary of Buddhism circulated in Buenos Aires while Borges devoted himself to writing essays, compiling anthologies, and giving lectures on or related to Buddhism? From that long final chapter of Edward Kahn's classical Buddhism, Its Essence and Development, I'm interested in this quote regarding the circulation of Buddhism in European context. Quote, "The year of 1875 marks an event of a great importance. Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott founded the Theosophical Society. Its activities accelerated the influx of knowledge about Asiatic religions and restored self-confidence in the wavering minds of the Asiatics themselves." Unquote. The activities of the Theosophical Society would have a considerable impact on the dissemination of Eastern philosophy, not only in Europe, but also in the United States and Latin America since the late 19th century. This will turn Buddhism into a matter of interest for the reading public, interest satisfied by popular newspapers and magazines. This popular Buddhism, so to speak, influenced by Theosophy, link Eastern philosophy and various versions of Buddhism with astrology, spiritualism, and occult doctrines. Many authors like Axel Gasquet, Martín Vergel, and Soledad Kereiac have variously analyzed the uniqueness of the early 20th century Buenos Aires Orientalism. Spiritist or theosophical magazines like Philadelphia or Constancia had an impact on the theosophical positions and the development of fantastic tales made by Leopoldo Lugones, Horacio Quiroga, and Attilio Chiappori. However, this study do not address the impact of these same or similar publications decades later. Noteworthy examples of these are the magazine Sofia and its continuation, Conocimiento de la Nueva Era, Knowledge of the New Era. Thus, between 1940s and 1970s, these magazines spread a particular vision of Buddhism just when Borges' aforementioned work related to the topic was happening. Reviewing the pages of these magazines, so significant facts emerge. For example, the publication in the same page of excerpts of the Lao Tzu Book of the Path and All Catholic Prayers, or a biography of Buddha featured on the same issue where appeared an article on Carl Jung's spiritualist experiences and another arguing how Leonardo da Vinci's vegetarianism was the factor in his artistic talent. In addition, major newspapers like La Nación or La Prensa promote lectures aimed at the general public addressing the same topics. Some of the titles are eloquent. I want to mention some titles. Tibet Temples and Symbolic, Introduction to the Theosophy, The Mystic Aspect of the Inner Path, Eastern Philosophy, Comparative Evolution of Hindu Wisdom, The Devas, Their Symbols, Sounds, and Colors. Sonia Bentancourt points out that as early in the 1930s, the question of theosophy in Borges' work will relegated to a secondary position and occasionally taken up ironically to define the pejorative condition of certain literary manifestations. On my part, I will argue that Borges carries out a series of operations in which, just as with the fantastic or detective genre, he offers an alternative version of Buddhism opposed to the one propagated in contemporary popular publications. Through the aforementioned reviews, lectures, later published as essays and anthologies, Borges puts together an alternative version of Buddhist history, philosophy, and literature. His goal is to challenge the overt interest of the public in the popular version of Buddhism and, at the same time, to propose a different kind of fantastic literature, opposed to the one influenced by theosophical thought, like the ones penned by Leopoldo Lugones or Quiroga. In 1945, Borges became unemployed, and to make ends meet, he would take up a career as a professional speaker. Testimony of this is the end paper of a biography of Schopenhauer, where Borges jotted down the itinerary of his lectures between 1949 and 1952. During those years, he would deliver a series of highly popular courses at the Colegio Libre de Estudios Superiores, a civil association that brought together intellectuals and professors expelled from the university by the Peronist authorities. There, Borges delivered a series of lectures that shaped his stance of Buddhism in general and Chinese Buddhism in particular. The first talk was related to the topic was given in June 1949 as a part of the course Great Mystical Thinkers, where Borges devoted a session to the figure of the Chinese philosopher Juan. The following years, Borges taught one of the most successful courses at the Colegio Libre, titled Introduction to the Study of Buddhism, which, as Mariela Blanco has pointed out, attract the largest audience in the Colegio's history with 191 registered participants. In this course, Borges presented a highly canonical view of Buddhism that, at least in its overall approach, followed the outlines of the classical manuals on the subject. In these Monday classes, Borges addressed different aspects that would shape his own vision of the history and philosophy of Hindu Buddhism. Lastly, in 1954, they taught the course Mystic of the East at the Sociedad Argentina de Escritores. In this final course, he dedicated several classes to Chinese Buddhism, one of the hexagrams of the I Ching, another on the paths of Buddha, and the last one on Zen Buddhism. It is through these three courses that Borges would design his own history on Buddhism within the framework of a divulgation setting. The absence of recording raises the question of which sources can be used to reconstruct Borges' public speeches during this period of years. The archive of the Colegio Libre de Estudios Superiores holds some unpublished shorthand transcriptions of the courses Borges taught. Unfortunately, none of the preserved transcriptions corresponds to the courses related to Buddhism. I thought the handwriting notebook with Borges constructed the classes to Introduction to the Buddhism course is still preserved. The 8 points we see in the manuscript, this one, correspond to the organization of the program that Borges taught in 1950. In the left margin of the annotated index, Borges displays a series of bibliographical references that reveal the sources used in his exposition. If we were to map out the sources based on the manuscript and the books by Borges preserved in the International Foundation Borges in Buenos Aires and the National Library, it becomes evident the importance of European authors. Thus, the Buddhism constructed by Borges is a nuanced and mediated Buddhism shaped by European translations, Eastern philosophy manuals, translations of Hindu or Chinese sources, as well as various biographies and essays on the figure of Buddha written in German, English, and French. Authors like, well, here is the manuscript and the transcriptions. All the bibliographical references there. Borges displays, authors such as Beck, Wendt Evans, Schopenhauer, Oldenburg, Deussen, Koppen, among others that we see here, are the material that Borges approaches to gather ideas, translated fragments, and paraphrase arguments. Based on this canon of authors and works, Borges will put together his own version of history, philosophy, and literary aspects of Buddhism, which will be transmitted in his lectures and later would inform his essay published in 1975 with Alicia Jurado under the title ¿Qué es el budismo? What is Buddhism? If you look at the structure of the essay, we will notice that the first 6 chapters corresponds almost verbatim to the manuscript of a lecture given in 1950, while the 9th chapter dedicated to Chinese Buddhism and the 11th chapter dedicated to Zen Buddhism probably draw on the now lost notes from the classes delivered in 1954. In this sense, the transition from the lecture to the text of an essay allows for the articulation of series of ideas about Buddhism, what Buddhism is, its history, and its philosophy. The Buddhism that Borges draws from German, French, and English sources is complemented by a second aberration that is worth nothing. It is related to the circulation of literary sources about the Eastern world. In 1940, Adolfo Bioy Casares, Silvino Campo, and Borges compiled the Antología de la Literatura Fantástica, in which they include some Chinese texts. I'm going to talk about only Chinese texts, but maybe you will find another kind of text, Arabic text or Indian text or something like that. In the copy preserved in Bioy Casares' library, Silvino Campo handwritten notes in the table of contents indicated who was responsible for selecting each of the collected texts. This allows us to confirm that Borges was responsible for the inclusion of the majority of the Chinese texts. In 1955, the anthology was followed by another compilation, Cuentos breves y extraordinarios.
Sorry, the T is todos?
The T, yes.
So the three. Thank you.
When Antología de la Literatura Fantástica reissued in 1965, 25 years later, the compilers will increase the number of texts. The reissue now includes, a larger number of Argentine authors and all the Chinese texts previously included in Cuentos breves y extraordinarios. The fusion of both anthologies marks a continuity between these two editorial projects that thought to gather and make an accessible a canon of stories collected during the 40s and the 50s. Several decades later, in 1973, Cuentos breves y extraordinarios will have a 3rd edition. The only change was the addition of 2 more texts taken from Chinese sources. As we can see through this series of editorial interventions, the presence of Chinese texts becomes a deliberate concern to both compilers. If Borges relied on European sources to consider the historical and philosophical articulation of his lectures on Buddhism, the same applied to the literary sources unearthed for his anthologies. Careful work allowed me to reconstruct, based on the specific copies preserved in the personal library of both writers, the specific sources used by both in publications. Here we have all the fonts of Chinese text in the anthologies. As seen here, the enumeration of books and editions used revealed a preference for compilators, translators, and predominantly English language essays, with lesser emphasis on German and French. As Rosario Huber pointed out, given Borges' ignorance on the Mandarin language and the absence of an institutional framework for knowledge production and translation of Chinese literature in Argentina, Borges engages in sinology through fiction. Although this statement of Huber was related to the fictionalization of sinology in the short story The Garden of Forking Paths, but Huber's observation is also relevant while considering the strategies Borges and Bioy employed when appropriating different Chinese texts. The first strategy has to do with the fact that the compiled texts are translations of translations. Borges and Bioy systematically read translations of Chinese texts into English, made renowned English sinologists such as Arthur Wiley and Herbert Allen Giles. The practice of reading Chinese literature in translation, later translated into Spanish by Borges and Bioy, means not only the circulation of Chinese texts, but also that under the guise of a distant illusion of an unknown source is an inaccessible language. Authors were afforded greater freedom while translating. This reveals that the process of appropriation is not necessarily based on the faithfulness to the source. A second characteristic related to the first concerns the possibility for authors to creatively recreate a plot they have read and remembered. An example of this can be found in Bioy Casares' diary, when the origin of one of the stories included in Cuentos Breves y Extraordinarios is revealed. I'm going to quote Borges' diary. Sunday, June 21, 1953. Rewrite the story of abstract or supposed organs. I attribute it to Mr. T. Cheng, an imaginary book, A Group of Leisure, Shanghai, 1882. I read it to Silvina and over the phone to Borges. It is approved, and I include it in the anthology of brief stories. The last aspect to consider has to do with the nature and importance of the sources read and appropriated. In many cases, there is not strictly literary text, but rather anecdotes found in footnotes, prefaces, and epilogues. In this case, for example, of the story about Poe's You Dream mentioned by Arthur Wiley in the preface of the edition Dream of the Red Chamber. This is Bioy Casares' own book. Or the anecdote about Xuanzi's dream mentions in Wiley's essay on Chinese philosophy. The copies of both titles preserved in Bioy Casares' personal library bear marks of the reading process. In both cases, the incorporation of these passages focuses more on their narrative possibilities than on the relevance that the selected fragments have in their context of the original source. This evokes what Borges had stated in the preface of 1941 edition of The Garden of Forking Paths. I'm going to quote Borges. A laborious and improvising madness is the composition of past books, to delay in 500 pages an idea that could be perfectly explained orally in few minutes. A better way is to pretend that those books already exist and offer a summary, a commentary. What this makes clear is the possibility of highlighting an oftentimes marginal brief text that shows narrative potential. The anthologies create a sort of fictional canon by collecting diverse twice-translated fragments that, through an editorial artifice, when gathered in collections of fantastic literature or short stories, become more accessible narratives of Chinese literature for the reading public. This strategy logic is also present in the chapter that Borges devotes to China, to Chinese Buddhism in his 1975 essay. Examining the development of the argument of this section of the essay allows us to observe the clear connection between a concise historical account of the dissemination of Chinese Buddhism and fictional narratives that, in almost all cases, come from the same sources used in the anthologies put together with Bioy Casares. In this way, Borges resorts again to the method of overlaying translated and reworked fragments of Chinese stories from European sources to illustrate Chinese Buddhist thought. In this section, 4 stories organize the presentation of theaters of Buddhism, of Buddhist philosophy. The first is the story of Xuanzi's dream, present in Wiley's book, reviewed by, later included in the anthology, in Cuentos Breves y Extraordinarios as an essay to In Other Inquisitions. Although the story is sometimes attributed to Giles' book, but Borges always returned to Wiley's version, reviewed by him in 1939. The same happens with the next text, which tells the dialogue between the ascetic and the emperor. Read by Borges as a passage in Humphrey's book, Buddhism, Borges marks a note of this passage, which he later incorporated, translated into Spanish by him, in an article published in La Nación. This article will be reused, paraphrased, and yet again in the essay on Buddhism. Finally, one of the Borges' most productive readings is Wiley's English translations of the novel Monkey. Reviewed by Borges in the article on Chinese allegory, also published in La Nación in 1942, the passage about the blank scriptures alluding to the verbal incommunicability of truth is marked in Borges' personal copy. Here you will find blank scriptures, page 287. However, the final parable concerning to the monkey sprites in the presence of Buddha is not present in the marks, the manuscript notes Borges taken in this version, but it's obvious that he read there too. Observing the material aspect of these stories allows us to notice the different layers through which Borges conceived in these chapters the relationship between the history of Chinese Buddhism and his literary sources. Considering these material evidences and these observations, we can conclude that Borges' appropriation of European Sinology and European Buddhisms seeks to distance itself from other expressions more closely associated with esotericism, occultism, and spiritualism. In the context of the rising interest in the Eastern philosophy, Borges will offer his own version based on erudite appropriation of erudite sources, doing so from a deliberate distance from other popular and dominant circuits during the same decades. At the same time, he proposes a series of Chinese texts mediated by translation of European sources that recover an imaginary of fantastic literature, opposed to the other models such as those Lugones and Quiroga. Well, thank you very much.